Okay, good afternoon and welcome to our monthly Dr. Joshua Speaks panel. Today's topic is Black speech, Ebonics, code switching, and the power of Black cool. I know this topic is going to be quite engaging, not only for our guests, speakers, but you, the online audience. With that in mind, and before Dr. Joshua introduces our guest speakers, I'd like to first share a few housekeeping items. For our online participants. The chat feature is available for any questions you may have for our guests. Feel free to type in your questions at any time, and at the conclusion of the panel, we'll do our best to answer your questions. We may not get to all of them, but we will capture them. Also in the chat feature, I have included our general email address. Feel free to make note of it. If you have any comments, questions, feedback, we definitely welcome it. We'd love to hear from you. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our host, my colleague and friend, Dr. Joshua Smith. He's the lead pastor of Zoe Christian Fellowship of Whittier, California, a professor at Biola University, and the founder of the Solomon Center for Hope, as well as this panel, Dr. Joshua Smith. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you, Jamie. I really appreciate that. And I'm just thrilled, as I usually am, as I always am, to have these talks. I have the privilege of just being connected with some amazing people who are doing great things in the world and are fantastic people in their own right, and have an opportunity to introduce you to a few of them here today. I will start with Connie St. John, who I've known for a number of years as a friend and as a colleague. And she is founder and president of St. John Consulting Group, and also of No Weapon Productions. She is a multi-talented person. Her companies, her individually and with her companies, she is a playwright, she is a screenwriter, she has done short film, she does consulting with companies and individuals using both innovation and entertainment dynamics to really help companies really do their best to impact their employees and impact the people that they serve. And she's really just a multi-talented person and has much to say on this topic, as among many things she knows about the area of communications, PR, all those other kind of things. So we're really looking forward to, I'm really looking forward to hearing her insights on this. And also my friend Jamaal Muwwakkil, he is a sociocultural linguist and educator. He's a PhD candidate in the Department of Linguistics at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And he has much to say on this topic, not just from an academic standpoint, but just as a person who is living life and engaging with people on a regular basis as an educator, and really analyzing the way that our speech patterns, particularly the speech patterns with African Americans, affect us personally, affect the world. And so we're really excited to hearing from them. As many of you saw on our advertisement, there was one other panelist, Kevin Bracey, who will not be with us today. As I shared before, I always invite people who are impacting the world, and Kevin Bracey is one of them. He just recently had an opportunity to impact 3 local school districts in his area, which literally were going to have an impact on tens of thousands of young people, and his passion to serve people is what has pulled him from this moment here. So at some other time, I will bring him back, but he won't be joining us today. But that's okay. We have a lot to share with this conversation. So looking forward to it. So with that, I'm just gonna open up the dialogue here. And first of all, I'm just going to start off with the concept of Ebonics. And, you know, some people kind of just know about it because it's sort of been in the conversation in the media for several years. It may not necessarily be a hot topic right now, but it's a way in which people have described essentially Black speech. And back in 1996, the Oakland School Board recognized it as a primary language of the majority of its African-American students, and wanted the educational system to take into account, just like we have other kinds of speech patterns. And so my first question to my panelists is, what do you make of the idea of Ebonics being recognized as an official language? What does that do for you, or how do you respond to that?
After you, Jamaal.
Thank you. First, thank you for having us, Dr. Joshua. I think this is a great privilege to be able to speak on this topic today. As it relates to Ebonics, and just to give a little bit of context, Ebonics is more of like a merging of 2 different words, ebony phonics, which is to say Black speech, Black sounds. The innovation of that term, I think, came out of Ernie Smith, who was a scholar and activist back in the 80s and 90s. The logic around acknowledging the reality of Black linguistic practices, Black language and culture, is to potentially use it as a tool for instruction. I think sometimes this gets lost in the mix. Some folks who really resisted the embrace of Ebonics as a frame or validating Black linguistic practice as like official and specific, they understood it to be, if we embrace it within a school district frame, that we're going to teach Black students Black language and culture. We're going to teach Ebonics, but that was never really the proposition. The proposition was, let's acknowledge the reality of the specific variety that Black students come to our public schools speaking, and use that as a tool explicitly to help them to learn the other areas of content that's in the curriculum. I think that this is prevalent within the paradigm of, say, English as a second language instruction, where you acknowledge the lived experiences and current linguistic competencies of the students you hope to instruct, and use those things as tools to help them to learn. I think it's a step in the right direction as it relates to engaging with the lived experiences of the students and trying to orient to them as they are in order to kind of get us to where we're going. I think the reception to it was a little tricky because I think of the negative implications of it, that Black people say don't speak English in this regard. And so it can be stigmatizing and othering if you take it that way. And I don't think that we ever got clarity on that point, at least from a public discourse perspective.
I completely understand everything Jamaal just said, and I agree, and I understood even at the time when it was first introduced. I've always had a challenge with it. Because it would be one thing if the language was a combination of, let's say, our native language from Africa, and we were using words from our historic language. Then I would have understood it a little bit better. But instead, to me, it was, I understood the attempt, like you said. I understood that the attempt was correct. And I also understood that it wasn't necessarily to start to teach it as another language in the school. But I think the embracing of it, to me, felt similar to if we were to embrace Southern slang from non-Black people, and words that they might use that are not necessarily, or pronunciations of words that aren't necessarily the correct pronunciation. And that's what I had an issue with. Was, for me, it's not our native language. It's not, an African dialect. I understand not putting people down because they speak based on, what they might speak in their family, and maybe getting an understanding of what those phrases mean, but embracing it as a Black language kind of thing. I don't think it was right. And I still don't feel that it's right. I just don't.
Talk to me more about that stigma. I mean, I certainly, when I first heard the concept of Ebonics, that was a big part of the conversation, is the stigma being associated with African Americans. Oh, they can't learn, so we'll need to give them, this is how we'll have to talk to them. They can't understand, these things. The other side of the argument, of course, was that African Americans were they were employing the language in ways that were innovative. They were exploring other kind of grammatical possibilities and expressing things that could not be expressed in standard English. That happens sometimes when you're learning other language. I remember in my Spanish class, there were things that just doesn't have an English translation because you can't say that in English, but here's a way of saying that in Spanish or in French. And so I feel like that aspect of it never got focused on, at least in that academic aspect of it. It may be picked up more in terms of like the the popular expression of it, hip hop, those kinds of things where there's an acknowledgement of the innovation, but in that academic sense, it was the innovative aspect of it was never kind of picked up on. How do we deal with that? How do we salvage that aspect of it? What do we do with that?
Well, I might note that there's been a fair amount of work in that respect, especially within a higher education context and within linguistics. So there's a subfield of linguistics called sociolinguistics that really just deals with the idea of variation from an intra-linguistic frame, also deals with variation over the course of time and language contact in different areas. And from that stance, we learned that there is no static, standardized English variety, right? It just doesn't exist. It is nowhere and no one speaks it. Everyone always speaks their very own, what we'll call an idiolect, right? Which is just your very own unique speech practices that are informed by your exposure and contact to your local community and other speech interlocutors. So the idea is you probably sound a lot like your parents, right? Because you spend most time with them, right? You learn how to speak from your local community, your siblings, your friends in this way. And so if we kind of take a little bit of a step out, we can see that also we can maybe make some trends or see some similarities between English speakers in California versus Mississippi versus DC or New York. And so understanding the histories of how these different language varieties become a bit distinct is an important area within sociocultural linguistics. Specifically related to Black language and culture, segregation plays a huge role. The emergence of Black people in the US under duress through enslavement and the subsequent laws that barred Black literacy, that barred Black communication, the overall disavowal of being able to use their own native languages within context really kind of set the stage for some innovative linguistic practices within those communities. And then after freedom came, but still segregation persisted, you had large groups of African Americans living amongst themselves, and therefore the trajectory of the evolution of English kind of shifted in different directions based on those geographical constraints. And so African American English is just a reasonable and historical result of those processes, right? It's not about, as some people might say, like biological differences or differences within cognition or anything like this. It's very much so a cultural artifact born of real logistical and geographical constraints that every group of people across the world kind of practice. Now the stigma comes in because there's a general anti-Blackness in the world, and language is just a proxy to impose that discrimination. Even at this point, we have protected classes, race, gender, sexuality, age, things like this. What we don't have is protection against linguistic discrimination. A mentor of mine, John Ball, in California, did a study a while ago where he was making different calls around housing in the San Francisco area. And he was able to code switch and put on a Chicano American English voice, a standardized American English voice, and an African American English voice, and found that he got way fewer callbacks or calls about vacancies or to see the property when he had on his African American English voice as opposed to his standardized American English voice. This was reproduced by my good friend Kelly Wright and in a different context and found similar results. So linguistic discrimination is very real and it's tied to the stigma of Black bodies as opposed to Black linguistic practices.
It's interesting, and Jamaal, you talked about the stigma, the anti-Blackness stigma, and I get that. And what's interesting for me, and you also brought up code switching, which I'm so glad that you did, because one of the things that we talked about, or you had us think about in advance, Joshua, was when did we first, for instance, experience code switching? And what's interesting is that the first time I experienced code switching, it was to switch to Black language, quote unquote. So much like Jamaal said, I was raised in a house where we spoke proper English, and I was, accused of talking like a white girl. So my first experience with code switching was trying to fit in with other Black people, not the opposite. And so for me, the stigma was initially the opposite of that. It was my quote unquote anti-Blackness, the fact that I wasn't Black enough in my speech. So then having something like Ebonics come up and thinking, I don't talk like that though. You know, there's never anything that applies to all Black people. They, you know, they want to lump us into whatever category, or all Black people do this, all Black people can do that. But the issue is that that's just not the case. So when it comes to things like the stigma of Ebonics, it was hard for me. I had to, you know, I'm getting my education from other people who know, you know, I remember standing in a delicatessen with my sister, and I could not, I swear to God, could not understand this guy talking to place his order. And I kept leaning over to her saying, wait, what did he just say? He was a Black guy. I couldn't understand a word he was saying. And so finally, you know, she would tell me every time, oh, he said this, oh, he said that. And I finally just said, you speak Ebonics? I didn't even know, because, you know, we're raised the same, and I could not understand what the man was saying. I literally could not being racist, he didn't seem unintelligent. I didn't understand his dialect. I just didn't understand it. And so the stigma is both, you know, within the anti-Blackness, if you don't speak Ebonics, or you can't, you know, manage to be in the hood and be among your people and speak a certain way, you're looked at as anti-Black or too white. And, you know, there's that piece of the code switching and the stigma there. And then there's the other side, which Jamaal mentioned, which is true, that, you know, I've had people who assume I'm white because they talk to me on the phone. And, you know, I'm going to a business meeting and they say to me, you know, I'll see you there. I'm blonde with a, you know, red dress on. And I say, you know, I'm brown haired and I'll have on blue. And I just give them just what they gave me, my hair color and what I'm wearing. And then I get there and they, you know, I say, hello, are you Sally or whatever? And, oh, no, I'm sorry, I'm waiting for somebody. Yes, you're waiting for me. And so, you know, I've had situations like that because I quote unquote talk like a white girl. And so there's that stigma. And I didn't have to switch to speak to that person on the phone. I don't have to consciously change my language when I'm calling the bank or to check on homes or change my tone. But when I'm in non, you know, mixed company, I have to think about code switching then and think about what slang, you know, and make sure I'm hearing with the right ear, I'm speaking the right thing in that situation. And so it's an interesting opposite dynamic.
Wow, my thoughts are going a lot of different directions. This is really good. So one thing I'm thinking about, I was recently watching an interview on YouTube of some of the former cast of Good Times, and you know, this is classic in a lot of like Black shows of that area right after, like you had the white writers who were trying to write for Black people, and some of the actors are just saying like, you know, one of the tensions in that show was like, we don't act like this. We don't talk like, how many times have you heard somebody say jive turkey? We don't say that, right? But those, you know, those, so like trying to sound Black. And at the same time, I feel like there's more subtlety in Black speech too. So some of it is the hard slang words, but to me, sometimes I feel like it's a thought process. So a person may sound quote unquote white per se, but I can, at least, I don't know the science of it, but sometimes I feel I can hear the thought process of how they're thinking through their speech. And that's signaling to me kind of a Black perspective, even though it may quote unquote sound white. And tell me more about some of those subtleties, because I think that gets missed sometimes in trying to be so on the nose of you speak Black or you speak white.
Yeah, I might say in that regard, and in response to Connie's points, which were great, that I don't think anyone's really making any points around one solitary exclusive Blackness. Again, for the same reasons that we said, you have, you know, generations, right? Jive was a thing back in the 70s, but people in 1990s and 2000s aren't saying jive anything, turkey or otherwise. But also the idea of like regionality, right? DC varieties are different than New York varieties, are different than Mississippi varieties, are different than Compton varieties. And there's that specificity, but there's also some shared commonalities, right? There's some things, and I think we found this out through Twitter, actually, in a lot of ways, right? That there are some specific words that people have, lexical items in their lexicon that are shared by Black folks across states and across boundaries. So there is a sense of a general shared Black cultural frame, but the specificity may differ based on age, location, and exposure. I'll also say it is absolutely true that not all Black people have to speak African-American English. And it is the case that some white people who grew up in Black communities can be native speakers of African-American English, because it's an exposure thing, right? It's how you get your linguistic input, right? And you're socialized into those frames. So Black English isn't specifically necessarily Black, but more so about a condition, a culture, right? Which I think is important to remark because it dovetails into some of your remarks, Connie. The idea of sounding white is very marked.
Offensive.
Yeah, it's an offensive frame, one, and also what do white people sound like? Because white people sound very different from each other too, for all the reasons that we stated, right? What I understand it broadly to be hearkening to is this idea of you're speaking standardized, what we call standardized American English, right? One of my advisors calls it hegemonic American vernacular English. But the idea is to say like this general standardized frame, what you might hear on the news, right? This thing, what we might call like journalism or media language. But all of this is to say there's so many variations to it, and it's relative to your hearer, right? So you might sound white to a Black person, but sound very Black to another white person, right? I remember the CNN commentator, I think CNN or MSNBC, Yamiche Alcindor. She's a journalist, and Tucker Carlson kind of took a clip of her work. And she was just speaking, as far as I was understanding, like standardized American English, like network speech, like it was very standardized. And he heard her speak and said, I couldn't understand what she was saying. You know, how can you be on TV with all this bad grammar and such? As a linguist, I could be like, well, I'm very well acquainted with grammar, and this was very standardized. So the idea was less about what she said and how she said it, more about who she was when she said it. And that's an element that we have to deal with. So I think there is a reality of relative engagement, sounding white relative to the folks, or sounding more standardized relative to my typical exposure. But that's also going to be relative to the interlocutor's exposure to folks like you. I myself and a group of my colleagues are doing a lot of research in this regard as far as Black folks in predominantly white research contexts, where this issue comes up a lot, right? Where the idea of Black racial development within the undergraduate context is really language dependent, right? People can hear you and say, are we the same or are we different? Not arguing that this is the best way to kind of make those type of decisions, but people's ears are attuned to it, right? They try to figure out how similar or how different we are from each other based on how we communicate. What are those cultural artifacts that we might be aware of? And sometimes, even if it's not from a linguistic frame, we can say from a cultural frame. If I were to quote the movie Friday to you, we might laugh about some similar things, right? If I were to talk to you about some cuisine that we might eat during Thanksgiving, we might have some resonance there, right? So I just argue that Black language and culture and some of those specific artifacts are represented within the Black experience, but not necessarily exclusive to it, right? There is no, you are Black, therefore you must talk like this. And if you don't, then you're not. That's not the claim.
Now, Connie, you have a lot of thoughts on this personally, but also as a consultant, you're working with people from a variety of backgrounds and situations. Tell me, if we could talk for a minute about code switching. You know, what do you find as you're coaching clients issues with kind of speech and code switching that emerge with your clients?
You know, it's interesting you asked that. I recently just finished a script for a client, and there was a phrase that I used. It was an historical story, but told in modern day vernacular. And at one point, the character was asking, why did you slap this person? And so, did she strike you first? And I used the phrase, did she call you out of your name? And the director's from Argentina. And he said, I don't know what that means. What does that mean when you say, did she call you out of your name? And of course, I hear it as, did she call you out your name? That's how I hear it, but I didn't write it that way. And so realizing, and I said to him, it's the same as saying, did she call you a name, but it's harsher. So what Jamaal was saying in terms of it's not necessarily, was it grammatically correct? It was, basically, but it had a different tone, or like you mentioned, Joshua, the thought behind it was different. And I found that as well, that there are phrases. I remember one time breaking my nail, and I said I broke it off to the quick. And I was talking to my white coworkers, and they said, what does that mean? That's a Black thing. What does that mean when you break it off to the quick? I have since learned it's not a Black thing. It is not. People who are not Black know what it means to break your nail down to the quick. They talk about it even with animals if you cut it too far. But it wasn't their experience to know that phrase. And so with my clients, most of the time, I don't find any, where we're speaking in a language that we both understand. But there are times when a statement is made. So I have a group of clients right now that are mixed race. And if one of the male Black clients says one thing, it's perceived as more offensive than if one of the male white clients says that same thing. And that deals with, that's a whole other issue that has nothing to do with the actual words. It has nothing to do with that. It's the perception of how, when you speak it, how do I perceive it coming from you as a Black person? And that's a whole other thing that's not linguistic. And yet their complaint is they said words that were offensive. And they put it to the words, but it's really not about the words. So in general, in dealing with my clients, I'm dealing with the same language. We're talking across the board, no issues, no communication challenges there, no linguistic challenges. But what's interesting, because as you know, I work a lot with observation. When I notice, that's interesting, this person could say that, but that person could not. We need to take a look at some other underlying issues that have nothing to do with words, that have to do with perception. And the only other thing I want to mention, Jamaal, everything I'm saying, taking copious notes over here. It's so good. But I will say, to me, Ebonics and speaking white, that to me, those two things are equated. Just like Jamaal said, there's no one white English. There's no one you're speaking white, because if you're in the South, speaking white sounds one way. If you're from, North Dakota, it's going to sound different. If you're in the Midwest or in New York or Boston, there's no such thing. Like he said, it's standard American English. I feel the same way about Ebonics. There's no one language that represents Black people, just like there's no one language that represents white people. So that, I think, is my resistance to the phrase, is that it does exactly the same thing. It lumps things into a category, and there is no one category for Black English versus white English. So client-wise, I don't really have that issue, except for, like I said, in terms of things like that, where I'm observing that it's not even about the language, it's about the perception. I do want to mention, though, when you were talking about things on television and how you can, speak journalism, journalist English. Years ago, my family was visiting me in California, and there was a journalist, and if I could remember her name, I know you all know who she is. She's a Black woman, highly intelligent, and she speaks 99% like a journalist. But one day she was talking about what had happened, and she said, but before they finished, they got their licks in. And then, and we were like, she just said, got their licks in. And she's a journalist. And we thought it was the most hilarious thing because, I mean, she was buttoned up until that moment. But she, dropped her guard. And I don't know who, did everybody understand her? Did all of her viewers understand what that meant when she said they got their licks in? I don't know. I did.
Connie, you brought up something I think that got to the heart of why I put this panel together, and that is how the same words are perceived one way when a Black person says it, and a different way when a white person says it. And it gets me all the time when Black speech makes its way back to the mainstream, and it's a form of social capital to be able to speak it and say it and to use it. And then when it's said in its original context, there is a stigma. There's a stigma behind it. And as you all were talking, one of the questions I have is, I really want to know what it's like to speak without an awareness of white people watching me and listening to me. I feel like, and as you're talking, I feel like that's somehow in the back. There's like, how does this resonate? Or I could say white or mainstream or whatever, but if that isn't part of the equation, then how then are people of African descent, especially focus here on certainly African Americans, but we can think broadly as well, then would we think about our speech if that was not a variable? Would we kind of recategorize the way we talk, or like how would it be? And I suppose it would be a world without code switching to some degree, but tell me your thoughts about that, for lack of a term, invisible eye or invisible ear.
Yeah, so of course it reminds me of W.E.B. Du Bois and double consciousness, right? This idea of the condition of Black people in America is one of a meta awareness of how they're viewed through the white gaze, usually for safety purposes, right? To make sure that they don't get caught up in some stuff. And so I think that's absolutely applicable to the idea of language use, especially in specific context, right? So it's a great question, because I think we should kind of dream and imagine, what would we sound like? How might we comport ourselves differently if we were able to somehow escape the white gaze? We have yet to reach that mountaintop, but it is, I think, something that we can aspire to. But I think that it also does influence our behavior. Another concept that comes to mind is the idea of who bears the communicative burden. Which is to say, whose responsibility is it to make sure that they're understood? And I think within the current paradigm, it seems to be the case that Black folks, especially those speakers of African American English, feel that it's their burden to make sure that there is clear and easily understood, specifically by sometimes disproportionately white folks who may not be familiar with Black or African American linguistic practices. And there's less of a concern, say, for the non-Black hearers to try to figure out, what could they have meant? It's just easier to write you off and say, that's broken English, try harder. Or you're being lazy with your speech, or you sound stupid, right? That's easier to say than to take up and say, maybe there's something that I don't know that I could benefit from learning. And so the communicative burden is therefore borne by, in this case, the marginalized population most often, and not borne by the hegemonic population. This is, of course, tricky because, and I think to some of the points you were making before, Dr. Joshua, there's two elements I want to invoke here. One is mutual intelligibility, which is the idea of, do we understand each other, right? So a person from, an English speaker from California can, for the most part, understand an English speaker from Florida, but might have a trickier time understanding an English speaker from Jamaica. Right? While Jamaican patois is English, it's a little jazzy to the American ear, the American English-speaking ear, and therefore there might be some words you get, there might be some words you don't get, right? Likewise, you have this other idea of preservation of meaning, which is to say there are some words within the canon of African American linguistic traditions that kind of have their own meaning, and you really can't say it without saying it that way. Like the idea of called you out your name. There's a specific something that's there that I could try to translate into more of a standardized frame, but I'm losing something, right? So the idea here is to less be prescriptive around what a smart person sounds like, right? Or what words a educated person should use and not use. Apparently ain't is still like jazzy. But more around the idea of like, whose responsibility is it to understand each other? I can try my best, but can I expect you to try a little? Is the idea.
That's it exactly. I think, that conversation is what I keep hearing right now is even as we're dealing with all of the things related to Black Lives Matter, whose job is it to help white people understand the plight of Black people today? And, is it their responsibility to do their research and try to figure it out and try to, come at least halfway on that bridge? Or is it our job to walk all the way across the bridge and try to get them to understand? That's always the question. And I think really it's the job of those who are willing, whether they're Black or they're white. It's the job of those who are willing. And, if you're willing to educate yourself, great. If you're a Black person who's willing and can bridge that divide to, share some things with your white colleagues, great. If you're not willing, then it's not, whether it's your responsibility or not, you're not going to do it. So, Joshua, I can't even imagine. I don't know what that would look like to not have the gaze, the white gaze. I don't know what that looks like. And I can't imagine what that would feel like. I don't know that. I don't have that. The word is escaping me, but it's not my reality. So I can't, maybe in a script I could imagine it or something, but right now I can't even put myself in that mindset. And even, like I said, being raised in a home where we spoke proper English is what we called it. We spoke proper English. It wasn't necessarily because we felt like we had the white gaze in our home. It's just how we were raised. It's, my parents were word people. They did, crossword puzzles and play word games. So it was our home life to know words, to understand words, to be educated. That was just our home life. I never felt like it was because we had the white gaze. Although what Jamaal said earlier in terms of how you are educated deals with segregation, that plays a huge role, and all of those things, all of the, discrimination, all of the reasons that we would have spoken proper English comes from all the history of why we would have spoken proper English. But I never felt like it was coming from the lens of the white gaze. However, much like you said, like with Good Times and, we always identified more with the Cosby Show. That's what our home life was like. But we would get berated by people whose home life was more like Good Times. And, again, same thing, called, you're not Black enough. You're just not Black enough. That, and us saying, my dad worked in the medical field. My mom was, basically a legal secretary. We were the Cosby family. Like, that's just what we were. That's how we talked. That's what we did. We did little parties. It was all of that. That was what it was. And it didn't feel like it was in response to the white gaze.
Yeah, thinking, I'm thinking as an English professor, I'm thinking about that this gaze, there's an aspect of it that even goes beyond race. And I say that because, I'll have interactions with people and we'll have small talk, see them somewhere or wherever we're talking. And I'll say, I'm an English professor. And immediately there's this sense of shame, wherever they are. And they start apologizing for, I'm sure sometimes jokingly, but like, let me correct my grammar or anything. And it's just, and it's just like they feel like they're like this grammar police person is now about to judge their language, and their language is a reflection of their class status. And so, when I talk to people or, people are correcting their papers, there's not a freedom for people to make mistakes. They feel like, the writing process is about making mistakes, and they want it to be perfect because they're so hyper aware of the implications of bad grammar. Now, the racial aspect of it adds another dimension to it, but I just find people broadly, the relationship between language and their status in life is very, and we do that. I mean, like this applies to, immigrant populations or what have you, the matter of language and people conflating how you speak English with some degree of your intelligence or your value. It just happens so much. So it's really interesting the way that happens. Why? I know we've talked about it a bit, but can you speak more, both of you speak about the relationship between language and our sense of value?
Well, I will say this, although language is often a reflection of class status, what was interesting is, when we were little, we were raised in the projects. That's why we didn't fit in. So our language didn't match our class. And that was part of the issue, that there was a sense of, you feel like you're better than us. You're speaking differently than us, so you must feel like you're better than us. But we were just speaking what we were taught, what we heard. So we felt devalued based on the fact that we didn't fit in. And still because of language, but not because of it being less classy. So, and then we moved to, it was the Jefferson's kind of story. So we moved on up, right? And we moved into a neighborhood that was predominantly white, and we spoke the same language as them. Now they're just looking at us for our skin color. They're trying to figure us out, and they're thinking, but we can understand everything you're saying. So I guess you're okay. And mostly we were accepted because we were, one of maybe 2 or 3 Black families in the neighborhood, but we spoke proper English. They understood us. Everything was fine. And then busing started. And when busing started, the people in the neighborhood where we lived, who saw us as different, quote unquote, different type of Black people, they could then only see a Black face. They forgot that we lived next door to them. They saw us as just another Black face. But the kids who were bused knew we didn't come in with them. So we didn't fit in with them either. We didn't speak like them. We didn't live where they lived. And once again, we were in this weird outcast, place, this limbo where we didn't fit in with the Black kids who were coming in, and we didn't fit in with the white kids that were living next door. And for us, for my sister and I at the time, what that served for us to do was to really judge people one by one. We realized it's not going to be as simple as we're Black, therefore we're sisters and brothers, or we speak like you, therefore we're sisters and brothers. It wasn't quite that simple for us. So, although our plight as Black people is the same as other Black people, in that microcosm that we were in elementary and middle school, we didn't fit in on either side. So we could only base it on one person at a time. And we learned to value people based on their individual character. Right now, with the issues that are going on, although that is still our foundation, we align with the struggle and the challenge that people in the Black race are going through, the Black Lives Matter movement and all of that, because our kids, our families, our brothers and cousins and our children are dealing with that. And it doesn't matter whether we all speak the same. The bottom line is that when this happens, they see brown and we're in danger. And so we align with that, our value. I think about Oprah, if you guys remember, they wouldn't let Oprah in that one store. And I want to say it was in France. She was just another Black face. And it didn't matter that she was a billionaire. She was another Black face. And you realize quick, that it doesn't class, money, status, how you speak. There are moments where none of that matters. Your value is not based on any of those things. It's based on I see brown.
Yeah, can't add too much more to that because I think you hit the nail right on the head there. What I'll just say, just as an official stance, is that we really need, I think, within the Black community and across the nation, to really just kind of make sense of individuals' humanity and not try to do this essentializing a one-to-one stance. So it is unfair that a person should discriminate against another person because they sound different, whatever that different sounding is, right? I'll also say in that regard that there is merit to a community value in this regard. And I think that that is absolutely part of the Black historical cultural heritage, that we see each other as, I think, closer relations than we might otherwise, because of this shared sense of exposure within a white supremacist framework, right? So we are all equally, independent of our class status, susceptible to violence along racial lines. And it doesn't matter if I didn't grow up around Black people, I don't speak the way that Black people speak, or I actually have money and I live in the other area. At some point, the stances of the person you're engaged with, that may not matter. They may see you just like the rest of them, and that can have deleterious consequences for you. So I think there is merit to kind of understanding the struggle as a collective struggle and encouraging folks to understand the full breadth and spectrum of the manifestations of the Black experience in the US context.
I have I'm gonna switch your gears just a little bit. Is Black speech cool? And I asked that question because, you know, certainly those are statements made about Black speech. There are times where I even felt a little pride about our contributions in that area, but recently I just been thinking about it as, I wonder if it's actually cool, or like calling it cool is a way of calling it something else.
So I'll jump in on this one real quick. There's a huge body of literature around that. So the idea is, one, coolness is relative, right? So it's always going to be situated within a local context. And what we might find is Black speech is oriented to sometimes as cool, especially amongst, say, folks who don't have a lot of exposure to Black people. So in some senses, you can kind of get the sense that Black speech and Black practices can be seen as deviant. So you're like a rebel because you kind of put on some Black like artifacts or whatever, right? You like hip hop, oh, you're a bad boy type situation, right? Such that that's cool. So there's some problematic implications to the exoticizing of Blackness and all the artifacts that are kind of embodied therein. As necessarily other different, exotic, cool, strange. So one way of kind of thinking about it is the idea of like, it's exoticized but privileged within some contexts, and therefore it's good. But if you take the first step, it's seen as other. Like I like to just make the point that Black people are American, just like Black Americans are American, right? And a lot of the other hyphenated Americans have this issue of being seen as the perpetual other, right? So if you have a model where Americanness is necessarily white, and therefore any non-white but in America is now other, exotic, and then calibrated based on the frame of like how prestigious or not, how appropriate or not within different contexts, it may not necessarily net a negative consequence in the moment, but it's built on shaky ground, that ground of like othering. So I will say to directly answer your question, is Blackness cool? I'll say not inherently, but often oriented to as such.
I get that. I get that. That makes sense. And that otherness, that exotic piece, you know, I just shake my head at it. But I will say this. What's cool to me, Dr. Joshua, is confidence. And so I think that when you start talking about like lyricists and rappers and things like that, and they turn a phrase and it is clever as can be. Like you think about when 24/7 popped up on the scene, and it was in our music first, and it was 24/7, 24/7, and then 24/7, 365. And now you hear journalists say it, which is, I remember the first time I heard a journalist say that on the news, and I thought that was wild. But part of it is the confidence. Part of it is the cleverness. It's the turn of a phrase that people immediately start repeating because it is so clever that they have to repeat it. Well, that cleverness to me comes from swagger. It comes from confidence. It comes from, like when they do the riff-offs and, the rap contest where they do the thing, you give them a phrase, they go at each other, and you hear the people, oh, all of that. There's some confidence in that. That's the confidence piece. That is cool. There's no question. That's cool. And when we see people imitating it, it's because it was cool and they want to do it. And, so I think yes and no. When we're exoticized and imitated, then no, that's not cool, because they're doing it to mock, and that's not the same thing. When you have, people who are trying to sound Black by, like you were saying with the Good Times writers and things like that, when they're, Jive Turkey and things like that they're going to guffaw at later, that's not funny. That's not cool. But similarly, to be honest, you get an Eddie Murphy saying, I'm not going to fall for the banana in the tailpipe. He's doing the exact same thing, mocking a white person based on their speech. And that's not cool either. We think it's funny, just like they thought it was funny when they mocked us and had us saying dynamite or they were saying dynamite. That's it. To me, it equates. That part's not cool. But when you get somebody who, turns a phrase that you hear and you think, wow, did you hear how he just put that down? That's cool.
I like how you brought that up, Connie. I think that, those moments where I'm really excited about Black cultural production, you find kind of this originality in the people who've been robbed of their kind of original sources of content because of, being displaced from their countries and their languages or what have you. We repurpose things, and that repurposing brings it. There's an inherent innovation. There's an inherent audacity in it that comes alive. I want to, with that, I want to, because I was kind of peeking at some of the questions that people had, and it was they were asking about kind of the implications of our speech being a Black speech being adopted by communities of other communities of color. And, historically, there's been ways in which people who didn't have our exact circumstances, but maybe in parallel circumstances, and are saying, hey, this is speaking my language, or this is giving language to an experience I'm having in a different context. And so I'm adopting this, and it doesn't, that could be a mixed bag too, but tell me about that, the way, certainly there's mainstream culture for sure, but talk to me about other communities of color that have resonated with Black speech.
I hear a lot about cultural appropriation, and I have mixed feelings about it. And I think because we can't distinguish when someone is admiring something versus when they're mocking it, it gets tricky. And so, but I think we also are dealing with oversensitivity as it relates to cultural appropriation, whether it's non-Black people wearing braids or, I think that we get a little overly sensitive because it's still just a hairstyle. And we can't just say, we're the only ones who get to wear it. So to me, there are phrases that might resonate, like you said. There might be, there might be language, or there might be phrases that resonate in any community where they're not mocking, they are embracing. They're saying, I know exactly what it means to call somebody out their name because my mama called me out my name. And that's what they mean. And they don't mean I'm trying to sound like a Black person. They mean I understand the meaning of those words, and that resonates with me in my house, in my neighborhood. And to me, that's not cultural appropriation. I think there's a difference, but it's so nuanced. It's hard to know when it's okay and when it's mocking.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. It's really tricky. The appropriation question is rough for a number of reasons. Like, so one would be social media, right? In one sense, folks are deploying their maybe in-house local linguistic and cultural artifacts to the public, as it were, via Twitter uh, for engagement, right? You want people to look at it, you want people to like it, you want people to retweet it. And if it's really popular, they might start using it themselves and they might ask, well, didn't you like present it to me such that I could use it? So how are you mad on the back end? And I hear that. The other side, of course, is as you alluded, Connie, before, the idea of overt mocking, right? So sometimes folks will kind of take a package of features and kind of make like a caricature of a persona of a person and then deploy that persona to overtly kind of dehumanize the people who use that language or who sound like that, right? So
Mhm.
that's a bit malicious. And so we have to allow for both of those things. We have to allow, and the base level sociolinguistic understanding, language change is natural, right? So people are going to be exposed to different things. The internet allows for some interesting affordances as it relates to exposure to different linguistic kind of mores and trends. And so you might pick them up. So you might absolutely have some input from your local friends and family, but also media, TV, Twitter, streams, like these types of things. And so you might have some lexical items in your lexicon that were not present within your local context because language change, right? That's just how it works. And that has to be okay. But that doesn't make overt, explicit, malicious, appropriate caricaturing okay at the same time. There has to be some lines, even if that line is a little blurry.
We still have some time left, but we're getting close here. And I just want to remind our audience, so I'm seeing some of your comments, and if there are some more questions, go ahead and type those in so that I can offer that to our panelists. Can we give some thought to, so we experienced the Obama presidency. We now get to look at Vice President Harris and her role, and they are sort of in some ways communicators in chief for the nation, and they also represent Black people as they're doing it. And so I'll start with Obama, for example. I can remember, we can all remember him trying to kind of walk that fine line. And, there were certainly times that I observed him trying to be in his speech more relatable to African Americans. And other times there's clearly, most of the time really, incredibly presidential. I remember a comment from Samuel L. Jackson critiquing Obama in one of those moments where he was attempting to be more casual, and it was like, hey man, we didn't elect you to do that. You should be presidential. And so I just remember that comment. So talk to me about certainly our former president and our present vice president, but also talk to me about Black persons in general in high positions that are maybe representative of people around the country, but inherently representative of African Americans, and the way speech plays a role in how they're represented and how they represent themselves.
Well, I will say that I get frustrated, to be honest with you, because I don't think anybody always speaks one way all the time. I think that there is casual speech, you're with your family, you're with your friends, you let your guard down a little bit. I don't care what color you are, you're with your people. And if you remember this, with President Bill Clinton, and, he could be presidential, talking about war and things like that. And then sometimes he'd get into that a little bit Southern slang. They considered him our first Black president until President Obama came along. He could go there with his slang and people embraced it. They felt like, oh, look, he took his tie off, basically, is how it was looked at. When it's a Black person doing it, it does have the implication of they're sliding into Ebonics, or they're speaking less intelligently, or trying to act more Black. And often it's just them, like you said, Joshua, it's just them being a little bit more casual. So I think that the judgment is unfair. How I might be, I remember one time I went to a movie with a former assistant, and he was a white male, and we'd never been in any casual situation like that. I went with my brother, he brought his girlfriend. We're standing in line. Well, I'm with my baby brother. So we are silly as can be, laughing and joking and being family. And his name was Blake. The guy's name was Blake. And I mean, his mouth fell open. And he said, I have never seen this side of you. I've only ever seen you buttoned up, you know, corporate, blue and gray, working with the attorneys, doing the thing. Like he could not marry those two images. It messed him up. And I told him, I am a human. This is my baby brother. I'm laughing. I'm joking. We're going to a movie. We're having casual time right now. I could be casual. And I think whether it's President Obama or Vice President Harris, that yes, they know how to be professional. They know, you know, how to present in any particular circumstance. If they're in a professional circumstance, they're going to present professionally. If they're in a place where they can be a little bit more casual, they should be given the grace to be casual.
So great points, absolutely, and agreed. We need to kind of engage the humanity of these individuals, and not that they have to be one thing at all times. I'll clarify that I don't think that it's fair at all to draw a distinction between Blackness and presidential. I think you should be able to be Black while being presidential. And any assertion that, you know, to be presidential is to distance yourself from Blackness is anti-Black. With that said, I think it's broadly the case that people speak to the audiences that are before them, right? Everyone does this. It's part of like how we engage our interlocutors, right? If you're looking to try to be persuasive, you look for little ends, like how are we similar? And are there maybe some speech patterns or general demeanor-based stuff that I can engage so that we understand each other, we're similar, right? Sometimes amongst the Black community, sometimes that'll be engaging in some Black linguistic practices. Sometimes it might be, say, a Southern white community, right? It'll establish a bit of a drawl, right? So we're the same, right? You can trust me, right? We do this all the time in rhetoric, right? I highlight broadly the idea of Black ministers in front of a Black congregation, right? That's an official capacity, right? Given a sermon. So that's not slang or lazy speech at all, but it could be quite Black at any given moment, right? So we have to be able to kind of understand what we're drawing bounds around and see if there's anything exclusive that might be a bit problematic. I think that Obama is an interesting case because, again, very little controversies as far as presidential tenures, right? Was pretty buttoned up, pretty straight laced, and still didn't get a lot of the credit from a lot of his interlocutors for having been so, especially since the next one came up. And again, so there's a book written by, contributed to by H. Samuel Lane called Articulate While Black. They really focused on Obama's speech. And there's forthcoming work coming out about Vice President Kamala Harris's speech. A good buddy of mine, Nicole Holiday out of Penn, is doing that work. But there's this interesting question around how Black can you be and still be taken seriously? And this, I think, is a trap. This idea that everyone else, Clinton's able to kind of engender himself. Hillary Clinton famously tries to engender herself to whoever she's talking to, right? And people get like the privilege to kind of switch around, kind of deploy, you know, what is persuasive in the local context, except for Black people, because you can't show that you might be ghetto, because at that point you undermine the office. Now you're a bad person, you're stupid, you snuck in, and we never should have gave you money. And it's not a rule that's applied equally. So I'm always frustrated when I hear things like this. He should be able to be his authentic self, even if that authentic self is not static.
That's it right there. That piece of this, it's a different standard that's applied to us. And that is the unfair part. And you brought this up earlier, Dr. Joshua, It's not just how we talk or what we say, it's the fact that it's coming out of our mouths. If I'm in a meeting, you know, and I've had this happen, I've been the only, not only the only Black, but the only female. So the only Black and the only female sitting in a room with white males. And if I talk adamantly about a point that I'm making, I am angry Black female. And when one of the males talks adamantly, he's so passionate about what he's saying. And that's always how it is characterized. We get no grace. The standard is not the same. The standard is not the same. Like Jamaal said, Hillary's gonna modify no matter who she's sitting in front of. And, you know, just adapt. She will chameleon herself. And yet, if we do the same thing, even a little bit, we're diminished, we're demeaned, we're ghetto, all of that. We're not as intelligent. It is not fair. That standard is not the same, and it is not fair.
There's a couple questions people ask that are very specific, and I'm going to get to those briefly. But as you were talking, I was trying to pair both, like, it's unfortunate, right? So we're in these moments where when we're speaking powerfully from our context to a situation, you know, what people lose in that moment because they can't see us, they can't hear us because they're seeing us in a way. You know, I'm recalling moments when Black speech is what gets the job done as an instructor. And I mean, I've taught in context, and most of the context I've taught in is it's not predominantly African American. I'll say that. And so sometimes I'm talking, I'm doing my best to kind of communicate in the way I've been communicating. And sometimes I just have to, I switch it up. You guys aren't hearing me, so I'm changing my tone. I'm stepping into my space. I almost feel like when I'm talking to my kids, they don't hear me. I take it up a few notches, and that gets it across. They understand exactly what I mean. Even if they don't know all the language I'm using, they get my tone and everything. And I think there's gifts that Black speech offers us. And I'm a musician. I think about instruments that have different ranges. There's things you can do on the piano you can't do on a flute or a saxophone, what have you. And there's a range to it and a breadth to it because African Americans have been stretched. And there's places we've had to go, not because we wanted to go there, because we had to go there. And in the context of that, we created and innovated and produced things that have now become gifts to the country when they want to use it for marketable purposes or whatever they want to use it. But then when we use it to kind of express ourselves or to lead or what have you, it's diminished. So just wanted to comment on that. And hopefully, you know, I know this is a conversation. Hopefully, as you know, we're trying to imagine that space where we can be just kind of be ourselves. I think that's, I mean, we're all looking for that. Everybody's looking for that. But I think, you know, that is the space that I'm even pursuing myself. I wonder sometimes how much I'm performing. And I said, what do I sound like when I'm not performing? And I don't just mean on the stage. I mean, you know, as an academic, there's a way that you speak. When I'm speaking, as you mentioned, Connie, I'm speaking to, sometimes I'm around African-American groups and I don't have all the lingo that they have in terms of the things that are associated with African-Americans. And I'm trying to make adjustments or, you know, when am I not performing? What do I sound like? And what does it mean to embrace being Black in those moments? I think that's an ongoing conversation. I think related to those conversations, there's a couple of very specific questions. One is directed to you, Connie. A person asked, can you explain what you mean by proper English and what cultural context is proper framed?
Well, I think Jamaal actually said it best when we were talking about standard American English, meaning very little slang, no heavy regional dialects, pronouncing words according to what is, you know, more as Jamaal said, media or journalistic, you know, English, where you know, that's what I was told in terms of proper English. You know, you pronounce the words correctly. I have to tell this story. It was, so when we were growing up, we didn't know the word finna. I mean, we'd heard about it, but we didn't know what finna even meant, really. but we would hear it sometimes and we didn't understand it. And so years ago, I was in California in a gym, and I had a black male trainer. And I hadn't heard the word finna in years for some reason, probably because I was living in the Valley regionally. I just didn't hear it a lot. So anyway, a white gentleman who had signed up to come to the gym came in, and he was like, "Hey, I remember you, I signed you up." And they, shoot the breeze for a moment. And then he says, "So what you finna do?" And the white guy says, "I'm sorry, what you finna get into?" I'm sorry, what? And he says, "What you finna work out on?" And he was like, "Oh, right, I'm gonna work out." He told him what he was gonna work out on. What was so interesting to me was that he never changed the word finna. It didn't even occur to him to change the word finna. It was what you finna do, what you finna get into, what you finna work out on. It didn't occur to him that the word that this man is not understanding is finna. Now, for me, having been raised in a home where I couldn't find finna in the dictionary, I wasn't allowed to use it. So for me, what proper English meant was, you better be able to find that word in the dictionary. And if you couldn't, we weren't allowed to say it. Not because it was too black. That wasn't the reason. It didn't matter if a white person said the word. That wasn't the issue. It was, this is not a proper word that you can find in the dictionary. This is not grammatically correct. You're not allowed to say these things. So in my home, speaking proper English meant words that you could find in the dictionary, basically.
That's fascinating because, for me, and I think Jamaal speaking to this as well, people who study language, like, we know language doesn't work like that. It's not the static. I mean, it's changing all the time, literally through usage. Yep. So it's always, it's always, again, because I'm an English professor, I just get it all the time. They find out who I am. They feel ashamed. And I'm thinking, for what? For what? I mean, I guess they think I'm about to, put some red ink all over, all of their speeches. But, it makes me think about, what is this kind of invisible ethic about speaking proper English? There's a pragmatism to it. I mean, we need to have some standards so we can communicate, but there's like this extra kind of ethical dynamic placed upon it. I have another question here, and either of you can answer. Someone wanted to, if you guys can give some examples. I think we kind of talked about this already, but like, what are some examples of Ebonics?
Right. So I might say, and we've used a few so far in this case. Finna would be fixing to, about to, going to, like this kind of progressive futurist type of a tense. Ain't apparently has overlapped with African-American language and culture, as well as general Southern. A lot of different, sometimes lexical items, but also sometimes like grammatical constructions. So stressed been, right? So I've been ate dinner, right? Which is say I ate dinner a long time ago. We even have morphosyntactic markers, like the idea of a habitual be, which is not present within standardized American English. So the idea of I be in Los Angeles, like I be in LA. Now, I may not be in LA right now, but I am often and typically, I am habitually in Los Angeles. So if I say I be in a place, I habitually or typically am in a place. These are markers that are distinct from, well, I would also add one of my favorite, like done, like the idea of multiple auxiliaries. I've been done that. This idea. There's a lot of different variations in this way, but the idea is less that, I think, to speak to a criticism that it's just kind of haphazard, right? That folks are just putting words together, using them all willy-nilly. This is actually not the case. Lisa Green's work as a Amherst linguist really focused on the systematicity of African-American language and culture, of speech practices, to really clarify that it's rule governed. There's some constructions that are appropriate, and there's some constructions that wholesale are not. A lot of times we focus in on the elements of African-American language and culture that overlap with what we might consider slang, which is an understanding of general like vernacular, sometimes like ephemeral usages. So stuff like jive would be considered slang because it's in the lexicon, but within a certain register, which is to say a very casual, like comfortable, non-formal register. Uh, Stuff like cap right now would fit that bill, or swag might fit that bill for another generation. I don't know if people still saying swag. Uh, but you have a lot of these different elements: the lexical, the syntactic, the general structural, sometimes the phonological. So the idea of people say uh, Black people drop their G's on like gerunds or progressive verbs. So running as opposed to running. Most people, by the way, don't do that. It's an enigma. Most people don't do that last G, but you only really hear it apparently when Black people do it. So lots of different elements that comprise a full spectrum of speech practices that are systematic and deployed by not every, but a lot of different Black folks across the nation and the world. Uh, One, just to kind of to borrow from another one of your examples, Connie, I did an interview with a colleague, Nebai Z. She was saying she's a Black woman from Compton, and she was starting at Santa Barbara, and she had a white roommate, and so she asked her white roommate at one point to cut the lights off, and the white roommate didn't know what to do with the lights. He was like, I didn't know that was a thing that wasn't universal. Cut the lights on or off. But as an example, so some of these are shared across varieties, across peoples, across regions. Some of them are distinct to so certain regionalities. Some of them are uh, generation locked, right? There's a lot of stuff in the 70s that I don't know nothing about. But it's part of, as Dr. Joshua said, it's part of language change that shifts over the course of usage. That's, I think, really fun to explore.
I love
Josh,
so go ahead.
I was just going to say, you know how we talked about the meaning changes. I've been done that. It's completely different than I finished it. Like it's not, it doesn't even mean the same thing. I've been done that. That's a whole other meaning. Then I finished it. I got it done. You have to use so many more words to give that phrase than I've been done that. So, there are reasons, like you said, there are reasons that we say certain things because it doesn't mean the same in proper English. So
No, I mean, language is always a reflection of the culture. I remember when I was learning Spanish in school, and I remember we'd always have the cultura sections, and I was understanding, well, why are we learning now? I'm just learning language. And I was like, no, I mean, the teacher was like, no, these things help you understand what's unpacking it, why it developed this way, and all those other kind of things. And Jamaal, as you were talking, you were just speaking to the strategy and the intelligence. Like, there's a reason why I'm saying this and not something else, because this other thing doesn't convey that. And I do have another question specific to you, Jamaal, but before I get to it, one of my questions is, how do we started off talking about like Ebonics and the term and the attempt to kind of dignify it. I think that was the intent, to dignify it, dignify the person speaking it. How do we engage with Black speech in formal ways without stigmatizing it? Because there are things for people to learn. There are innovative things happening. There's intelligent things happening. I mean, like, I think about, for example, when we study other languages and their adaptations and the things we get from that. Hip hop, which has been informed by a lot of different things, not just African-American culture, but certainly African-American speech and language and culture has informed that it's global. It's a global language. How do we engage with that without stigmatizing? And maybe that just is part of the package to some degree of it, but how do we do that?
Yeah, I think it's tricky. So sometimes we can look at the specific negative outcomes that we want to avoid. So in one sense, you have a overdiagnosis of elementary school students with special education who happen to speak African American English, right? So there's a case in Ann Arbor, Michigan, around '79, where this was famous for. but it's prevalent even to today. So this wholesale lack of familiarity with the speech practices of Black children results in their overdiagnosis and over prescription to special education, which sets them on a rough track for the rest of their public education career. We could do something about that with a little bit of familiarity and humanizing, right? There's court cases, right? So a famous piece is the George Zimmerman trial, right? And Rachel Jantel, a friend of George Zimmerman, who was on the phone with him as he was being, I'm sorry, a friend of Trayvon Martin was on the phone with him. And her testimony, a speaker of African American English, but was treated terribly and understood to be awful and dumb and unreliable as a witness because she sounded the way she sounded, right? I think at the very least, familiarity with linguistic variation, especially within the context of anti-Blackness, can really help to assuage some of those negative outcomes, because it is, as we've mentioned before, it's not about what we're saying, it's about who we are when we say it, but those specific artifacts of language can really have a negative consequence to the people in specific contexts. We need to create an environment where that's less easily accomplished, to make a person sound uncredible, untruthful, because they talk how some Black people talk. That should be impossible in our society.
I agree. Period.
Well said. Well said. Okay, so we have a few more minutes left. I think I'm gonna ask this question verbatim. This person had a question specific to you. It says, I appreciate your comment about knowing and presenting to your audience. However, do we undermine ourselves or our cultural humanity by denying the language that's comfortable at the time and allowing our audience to be learners?
I hear that, and I hear where you're going with that. And I think that it can absolutely manifest in that way. What I might say is it's a part of the human condition as it relates to our communicative practices to vary our presentation in a way that might be most effective to the audience. We all do it in all facets of life, and it's a part of, I think, actually acquiring a language. If you have an L2, right, a second language that you've learned afterwards, you understand that there's different registers that you would use that are appropriate in different spaces. I myself studied Japanese. And Japanese has a lot of kind of like relational dynamics, even as it relates to like the verb, right? So the verb changes based on who you're talking to. So you can lower yourself or you can elevate your interlocutor, right? And the appropriateness of your speech will be relevant relative to who you're talking to in that local context. So I don't think it's necessarily dehumanizing to shift to a speech style that might be most persuasive in a local context. With that said, I want to be clear to say that it is not the case that Black speech is always ever anything. So I'm thinking about the idea of if you're given a testimony on the church stage, that's a genre of speech, right? That has specific kind of like tropes and things that you kind of do, right? There's some quotations of biblical passages, right? There's the build-up, right? Telling you how far the Lord then brought you, like this type of thing. There's a lot of things that will be persuasive if you do them within that genre, but if you did them outside of that genre, like say in a job interview, people would look at you a little weird and say, why are you talking like this? So none of them are bad, but they may be more or less well suited for a given context. But I think what gives us strength and power in this regard is awareness, right? So if you know what's happening, you can isolate what are the conventions within this genre, then you can make decisions around how you'll present yourself. Sometimes you might say, I understand this space to be an anti-Black space, but I think it's wholly unacceptable. And I'm going to give you a little bit just to challenge and push those boundaries, right? I could not, but I'm going to choose to do so. Or you might say, I really need this job and I need nothing to go bad. So I'm going to make sure that you see me in the best possible light, even if that me doing so is really problematic. But at least you'll know enough to make the decision for yourself, come what may. And that's what I push for. Just a general awareness of these dynamics so that folks can make the best decision for themselves.
I agree with what Jamaal said. And even as a writer and a public speaker, what I tell my clients as well is always consider, what is your ultimate objective? Is it educating them about who you are and you want to bring them along in how you're speaking? Or is there another point? Is there a different objective? Because as Jamaal said, if the objective is get the job, then you speak however you need to speak without compromising yourself, obviously. But you say what you need to say, speak the way you need to speak, that is going to get you the job. It's based on the ultimate objective. And so, no matter what you're saying, what you say, the words you choose and the tone you choose to say it in, and the dialect you choose to use should be based on what the ultimate objective is in that particular context.
Well, very wise words. Fantastic conversation today. I learned a lot, was definitely provoked. The viewers certainly have as well. A lot of comments here. They've been asking questions. So for those of you who want more information about our panelists, you can read their bios at drjoshuaspeaks.com. I want to thank all of you for joining us. Jamaal, Connie, thank you so much for taking time out. These are people that are making it happen. So I appreciate them taking an hour and a half to join us. So until next time, appreciate you all. Thank you so much and have a great rest of your day.